Thank you all for sticking it out through the last panel, and thanks again to my colleagues, but particularly to Junko and Dennis, who've been real stalwarts in our partnership to keep common issues of Japan and U.S. on the front burner of analysis. Let me pick up on something which I think is, as with so many things, starts with a U.S.-Japan aspect but becomes a general issue, and that's the question of currency and so-called manipulation. What we've seen is some very ugly resurrection of Japan as the boogeyman by people who were Carter-era officials, people who own large houses in Detroit, and Arthur Laffer. And this kind of initiative is not helpful. It's not helpful mostly because it's bad for the U.S. And so let me try to explain why it's bad for the U.S. Because it's ultimately talking about a currency war as a phony war. And to whatever degree there's been a war, it's already over. So spoiling our trade negotiations and our relationships with our allies for something that didn't really exist is a very poor idea. Start off with the idea of trade manipulation, currency manipulation in Japanese trade. Since April 1st, 2004, Japan's Ministry of Finance has intervened in currency market a grand total of 11 times. Most of those occasions took place immediately following the great earthquake and tsunami and the nuclear accident, under complete agreement and coordination with its G7 partners. There was one intervention later that year in 2011. Japan's G7 partners, including the US, complained. Japan immediately stopped. I remember discussing with the Vice Minister of Finance, Mr. Watanabe, who took over in April 2004, when they decided to stop doing large-scale currency intervention. And I'm not going to quote him because my memory is not perfect of our conversation at the time, but essentially it was, well, come on, we woke up. This is something that is self-defeating for Japan, both politically and economically. And that, in a sense, is the big message, that country after country that's engaged in this, with the exception of a couple small countries I'll come to, has basically decided this is a self-defeating behavior. We can see this right now with China as well. China had been egregiously intervening in exchange rate markets in the early 2000s against the dollar, as my colleagues Morris Goldstein, Nick Lardy, and Fred Bergston pointed out. At that time, it was running a 10% of GDP trade surplus. In the years since, as China has grown in sophistication and depth as an economy, as it has seen its role in the world economy go up, as it's seen its political vulnerabilities go up, as it has matured, China has cut back repeatedly and forcefully on its extent of currency intervention, and in fact has basically been in diplomatic accord with the US government over the last couple of years. It is interesting to note that at the moment, even as China slows down, it has chosen to barely intervene in the currency market. It has chosen to intervene in very small amounts, approximately a 20th of the scale that it was intervening in 10 years ago. And that, of course, is against an economy that is roughly 4 times the size. Premier Li gave a bunch of statements on stimulus for the Chinese economy. He mentioned a number of domestic measures. He said nothing about the exchange rate. Similarly, you heard Heizo Takanaka speaking largely on behalf of the Abe administration today. He gave a list of Abenomics interventions and the needs for change in Japan. The exchange rate was not mentioned once. Grown-up countries realize this is self-defeating. And a grown-up US should realize the best way of doing things is to encourage countries to come to that realization and do so through diplomacy and not through idle threats that cannot be implemented anyway. Now, there's a lot of garbage being put out there by various interest groups, I don't need to name them, making various claims about Japan. Of course, the yen has depreciated enormously over the last few years. Most of us would suggest that that has something to do with quantitative easing. That would seem to be the cause, just as it was relating to the US dollar in 2008, 2009. But While the yen has declined by a huge amount, depending on the day, the Japanese trade surplus has gone into deficit. The Japanese bilateral trade surplus with the US has barely moved. Japanese foreign exchange reserves have been not risen a penny since December 2011. Now, there is a bad report out there by the EPI which suggests that, oh, Japanese have accumulated huge reserves, so we know they're intervening. But of course, they play the sleight of hand by adding up those reserves in yen terms. The actual amount of reserves hasn't changed. They've simply gone up in nominal terms in yen. There is nothing going on. There is nothing to see here. Moreover, when we look at the Japanese situation, including in such sensitive areas as the auto industry, there is very little correlation between Japan's market share in the US auto market and the yen rate. I realize that seems counterintuitive until you start really thinking about it. That people make choices about autos in part as durable goods based on brand, on quality, on convenience, on reputation. That in the end, 70% of Japanese auto manufacturing, 70% of the value of all autos sold in the US is manufactured in the US by Japanese firms. By the fact that, as with American firms like GM, Caterpillar, United Technologies, and others, a huge share of what goes on that's supposed to be exposed to exchange rates is actually transfer pricing within a company. And generally, these major companies retain their prices in local currency terms and either eat or gain those changes over time. And if anything, we have seen Japanese companies increasingly engage in this behavior over the last 5 years. The Japanese share of the US auto market has been flat for the last 5 years, even as the exchange rate has moved massively. We sometimes hear claims from various industries that Japanese autos in particular, have an unfair advantage because they have a closed market in Japan and that generates huge revenues, which then can be used for R&D and other kickbacks, not kickbacks, side payments to customers. Of course, this is factually incorrect in the sense that, A, we know that Toyota and Honda did much lower incentives to customers over the last 10 years by a huge factor in terms of frequency or size than GM, Ford, or Chrysler. And more importantly, we know that over the last few years, the big three US automakers have sat on huge piles of cash, far dwarfing any claims about the amount of gain in the Japanese auto market that they could choose to put into R&D or to marketing if they want, but they have chosen instead to sit on the cash or return it to shareholders. That is their right. That's perfectly reasonable. But when you sit on a cash pot of $5 billion, to complain about you can't keep up with a supposed R&D subsidy of $100 million seems a bit absurd. I think it's also important, though, to get beyond the Japan specifics and understand why repeatedly responsible US Treasury officials in both parties, Geithner and Posen, for example, have refused to name China a manipulator and have generally pursued a diplomatic course rather than trying to create rules and threats about exchange rates. The basic idea is you're dealing with other sovereign countries, and you're dealing with them across a range of agenda items. And you have to ask how much you're going to poison relationships by rattling your sword, and you have to ask yourself how much damage you do to your own country when you do something like that. We know, as I said, that the Chinese behavior on terms of currency intervention has changed massively in the last dozen years. I admit that in 2004, I was, along with some of my colleagues, complaining to then Treasury Secretary, I guess it was Posen. What, sorry? Which one? Snow. Oh, Snow. I always forget about him. Snow. Sorry. That, why aren't you calling China out? And instead, what we've seen is a succession of diplomatic initiatives that have led to Chinese changing this behavior without a direct cost to the US and without an escalation or spillover into other areas. This actually, in the context where we have today repeatedly, and I think justifiably, criticized the Obama administration for their handling of the AIIB, they deserve great credit for their deft economic diplomacy, first under Undersecretary Brainerd and now under Undersecretary Sheets, that in late 2012, we had an explicit agreement in the G7 not to have intervention unilaterally against each other's currencies, and that was immediately used to keep Japan in line. And then we extended this agreement informally at the latest G20 summit of economic deputies. Until we created this AIIB notion, the Chinese government had largely gone along with this, and we have not seen the kinds of interventions. Now, I realize I'm about to ask the impossible, but imagine a congressperson in the US who actually thinks other countries exist, okay? You're another country. If you're the US, and you sit there and you say, I hate extraterritorial rules. I hate all these people with their black helicopters imposing rules on my guns, on my environment, on my food. And yet, we, the US, are going to tell a small country like a Vietnam, a developing country like an Indonesia, that we are going to impose upon them a constraint on their ability to ride out the basic macroeconomic cycles in the world. What arrogance, what short-sightedness. This is a poison pill that is sure to kill any future trade agreement, whether it's TPP or not. It also is an absurd concept to think that somehow a Singapore, a Hong Kong, is somehow exploiting the US. That remains, of course, the great myth of all this and goes back to the Japanese boogeyman and the mercantilist view of trade I spoke about earlier. The idea has always been, since the Carter era, or for that matter, actually since Connolly and Nixon, let's start there, that the US has somehow been the victim of international economic trends, that we somehow were always getting taken for a ride by these pernicious foreigners who were playing games with their exchange rate, were blocking our exports. And yet, on every gravity model, the extent of trade that the US has and the extent of ownership that the US has and the extent of inward investment that the US has far exceeds anything that the fundamentals would have. On any economic model, the investment in US reserve currency, US denominated assets, the interest rate benefits we get from being the reserve currency far exceed any other country, especially controlling for our trade deficits. This ongoing sniping, as though even if it were relevant today, the idea that Japan somehow put one over on us back in 1982 or 86, and somehow there never would have been any foreign automobile sales in the US today if only we had gotten past their trickery, that somehow Detroit would still be making everything as it did in 1948, if only we hadn't gotten rid of these terrible, if only we had gotten rid of these terrible trade blocks. The idea that the US, which has had decades of outperformance given its low savings rate, low investment rate, on productivity growth, mostly because we allow competition from abroad and have globalized, would have fallen behind and had noticeably higher employment on average if we had simply stood up to these pernicious foreign forces is patently absurd. And yet that is the vision that the opponents of TPP and many of the advocates of currency manipulation legislation have for us. It is a pessimistic vision, it is a distorted vision, it is an unfounded vision. And it's time for us to get past that. Fundamentally, this does not let Japan off the hook. Picking up on Jeff's presentation, I would just say that we are at the point where the Prime Minister of Japan and his government must fish or cut bait, as the saying goes, on agriculture. As Jeff has noted, the US government has come out and has made offers to Japan, we don't know the details, but we know basically, that do not require zero tariffs in pork, that do not require complete opening of the dairy market in Japan, but simply require significant progress, enough to make it worthwhile for US congresspeople from the wrong states to get on the right side. The Prime Minister of Japan, for all his talk, has failed to deliver on this. And it's fine for Heizo Takanaka to say it's like the NRA, and I understand that that is a very damning comparison. But the bottom line is, when President Obama went to Tokyo after Vice President Biden stood up in the security sense for Japan over the islands, which Admiral Blair knows well, Prime Minister Abe failed to deliver on agriculture. When Prime Minister Abe came to the US and had a last summit in Washington with President Obama, he made promises on agriculture and again failed to deliver. For all my wanting to get rid of the nonsense of currency manipulation arguments, and especially to step away from the idea of Japan as boogeyman, either past or present, the responsibility of the Abe government for their own people, as well as for broader US-Japan relations, mandates that they do have to make the deal. They will not get another chance at this deal anytime soon. And just to drive home something that I said, if I may make one last comment, at a previous Sasakawa PIIE joint event, were Japan to liberalize its agricultural markets, it would immediately deliver roughly $1,500 a year to every household in Japan. This is equivalent to a very large tax cut and a very large stimulus. It reminds us that trade deals are not about opening the other person's market. It's about getting the gains to the consumers in your market and putting the competitive pressures on your market. And when we look at Japan's failings of the last 20 years economically, it goes with the fact that they did not liberalize sufficiently. That's one recurring message of today's conference. Let Japan take TPP as that opportunity to liberalize. Let us encourage that in the US by not engaging in false claims about currency manipulation. Thank you.